In 2020, my mom and I decided to go on an overnight camping trip together on the Oregon coast. I picked what looked like a pretty campsite from a campsite app, and off we went. When we got there, we realized it was right off the highway, but there were enough trees and a fence up front that you couldn't really see the road. But the gate was just a metal gate that swung into place, no locks. There was a house on either side, but the property was fenced in on both sides. We pitched the tent pretty far back, close to the woods on the back of the property. The closest house was about 100 yards away, and the highway was about 200 yards away. But again, it was all mostly fenced in and surrounded by tall firs. It was a lovely sight, and my mom raved about how beautiful and peaceful it was. I will say that I got a feeling of dread as soon as we walked onto the property. But we arrived late, and I didn't know if we'd be able to get to a new spot quickly. My mom could tell I was nervous, but for some reason I put her enjoyment of the beauty of the campsite over my feeling of dread. We made a nice campfire and enjoyed some hot chocolate as we watched the fire. I kept an eye out and didn't see or hear anything odd. My mom went to bed before I did, and I stayed up and watched the fire for a long time before going to bed. Finally, I tucked in, very exhausted from staying up. At 2 a.m., I woke up to twigs snapping and what sounded like someone dragging their fingers on the side of the tent up to the front. I sat up and grabbed the phone and the only weapon I had, a large flashlight, and unzipped my sleeping bag in case I needed to fight anyone. There was a full moon that night, and I couldn't tell if it was a person's shadow falling on the tent or if it was a tree branch shadow moving from the wind. It sounded like there were two people outside trying to be quiet. We had brought our boots inside, so there was no indicator outside of who was in the tent. It felt like they were trying to gauge the tent while I was listening for where they were. I had made sure to make enough noise so they knew someone inside was alert, but no more than that. If they know someone is awake, they can't surprise us, but they also don't know who is inside the tents and whether or not we have guns. I sat there in the dark until dawn. My mom slept through the whole thing. When we got up and out of the tent, small things had been moved. Our camp chairs had cup holders. One cup that had been in a cup holder was on the ground. A pen that had been in a cup holder was also on the ground. My mom raves about how good her sleep was and how refreshing it was to camp there, so I didn't want to burst her bubble or scare her. We packed up and I didn't tell her, but let her have a nice memory of deep rest and relaxation while camping on this beautiful property. Was it someone living in the woods, someone walking down the highway in the middle of the night? Creepy neighbors, who knows? My mom got a great experience and I got a refund and a fear of camping. The property owner said they might set up cameras to keep an eye on things in the future. People are scarier than almost anything else that could be out there. I've never really had paranormal experiences, but I cannot explain this. I'm in college, and me and some other 7 people from my school went on a backpacking trip, and we had 2 experienced leaders. We drove to Zaleski State Park, which is an Appalachian region of Ohio. It was early April this year, and it was cold and everything was still dead from winter. After hiking miles into the forest, we set up a camp at the backpacking campsite, and there were a couple other groups of people as well. A few of them were friendly older couples, and then 2 college-aged girls. Everyone was pretty spread out from each other. We set up camp further away from everyone else. I have always been able to sense the energies of places. The energy in this area wasn't great. It was almost spooky. Each of us had individual 1-person tents, and we formed a kind of cluster on this site, with my tent being in the back so no one was behind me. Our cluster was also right next to the forest, because this backpacking site was like a big cleared off square in the middle of the trees. Fast forward, I'm dead asleep around 2 a.m. I wake up to leaves crunching right behind my tent. I hear footsteps walking in circles around my tent. They had a sort of heaviness to them that couldn't be a deer or a dog. Also, it sounded like just 2 legs. I cannot make this up. This creature was circling my tent for long periods of time, slowly creeping to the sides of my tent, and then just stopping for periods of time, and then would move on to walking around the rest of our tent cluster. I could hear a human-like breathing from the mouth when it was close to my tent, like a light sort of heaving. I was shaking, too scared to unzip my tent and investigate. I kid you not, this occurred for hours, and it seemed I was the only one awake. Out of nowhere, I see an illuminated light shape from my tent. Although I couldn't tell what it was from inside my tent because it was all zipped up, it was like a warm glow, and it didn't move, like a flashlight would. I was paralyzed in fear. I simply couldn't believe it was an animal. At some point, I fell asleep due to sheer exhaustion, but I could hear the heavy footsteps circling until I did. In the morning, I questioned my fellow campers about it, and my leader admitted she heard the footsteps and noises as well, admitting it was bizarre and she would have investigated had she not been so groggy. One of the boys in the group said he also noticed the light that came, but thought it was someone else. Not a single person in this group went up to the bathroom or turned on a light that night. I heard things about the Appalachian regions being creepy and bizarre, and now I believe it. This happened to me when I was around 10, camping with my family at a provincial park in Newfoundland, Canada, in the mid-1980s. In Newfoundland, there's a lot of traditional folklore about fairies and being fairy-led, like being mesmerized or stolen by the fairies. And although I've never really believed in that stuff, whenever I hear those tales, I can't help but think about this experience. We arrived at the campground around mid-afternoon. I remember that it was strangely empty. We saw no other occupied sites as we drove around, looking for the perfect spot. We picked our site, and as my parents were setting up, my older sister asked if she and I could go check out the little beach area, which was a short walk around a clearly marked downhill path through some birch woods. Our mom said yes, but told us to be back in 2 hours. We found the sign pointing us to the beach trail and headed down the path. Almost as soon as we were out of sight of the campground, things started to feel off. It was weirdly quiet, with a sort of muffled feeling. No birds calling, no breeze, just a thick velvety silence. I also noticed that there were strange-looking ferns growing thickly along the paths all around us. Ferns are not an unusual sight in Newfoundland woods, but these were different from the ones I'd seen before. Bright, almost luminous green, and very, very large. Some were as tall as I was. I couldn't shake the feeling that there were people or animals hiding in them, watching us pass by. Although it had been a lovely, clear day, the weather started to change as we walked. A low-lying fog rolled in as we descended, first in tendrils close to the ground, then gradually rising around us as we went lower towards the water. Even living in Newfoundland, I never walked into a fog like that before, and it did nothing to relieve the eerie feeling that I was trying to ignore. Finally, we arrived at the steep set of wooden stairs, and following them, we emerged onto a small foggy beach. With the woods behind us, and above us it felt very closed in, and I started wishing that we were safely back with our parents at our campsite. My sister made a small noise beside me, and I turned to see what had caught her attention, although I thought we were alone. I now noticed that there was a man several meters away, standing very still and gazing silently over the water. My sister called out a friendly hello. It was Newfoundland in the 80s, people did that sort of thing. But he didn't move or appear to hear her. After a minute or two, I started to feel nervous, so I talked my sister into heading back to our campsite. This is where things get a bit fuzzy. I don't remember leaving the beach, but the next thing I knew, we were on a wide, unfamiliar dirt road. It seemed like no time had passed, but I was tired and my legs and feet felt like they'd been walking for a long time. The sun was also pretty low in the sky, which was strange because I thought we'd been gone for less than an hour. I felt disoriented and had no idea where we were, and I started to panic a bit, thinking we were lost. My sister immediately went into protective older sibling mode, saying not to worry because she was pretty sure she knew the way back. We headed off the down road in the direction she suggested, and walked for about 45 minutes or so, until we finally emerged on the campground, not far from our campsite. It was now almost completely dark, and we ran to our trailer to find our dad there, worriedly asking where we had been. Although we thought we'd been gone for less than 2 hours, my dad said we'd been gone for more than 5. He said that our mom had headed to the beach to look for us while he stayed to wait for us at the campsite. By now, full-on darkness was settling in, and our dad was worried that our mom had not returned with us. As he prepared to go out looking for her, she burst in the door, frantically saying that she had run up and down the trail multiple times and still hadn't found us. She was amazed when she saw us. The only way to that beach, aside from cutting through steep, thick woods, was to take that trail, and we had not passed her. Once we all calmed down, we ate dinner and headed to bed. As I lay in my bunk, I remember hearing my mom quietly telling my dad how creepy and strange the trail had felt. Although we planned to stay longer, we packed up and left quickly the following morning, and never returned to that campground again.